Welcome to our annual Year in Review Vulnerability Briefing webinar. Thank you for joining us. Again, I'm Danielle Gauthier, Senior Product Marketing Manager for Threat Intelligence and Worldview at Dragos. This is the second of 3 webinars to present the findings shared in Dragos' ICS OT Cybersecurity Year in Review. Today, we're going to be covering the details of our research on the state of industrial control system vulnerabilities throughout 2022. Now, before we get started, I have a few housekeeping items. This session is being recorded and the recording will be emailed to everyone after the session. Also, your microphones have been muted, but we still want you to interact with us. So please use the Q&A chat feature to submit any questions you have, and we'll try to get to all your questions at the end. Now I'd like to introduce the speakers of today's session, 2 of the highly skilled vulnerability analysts that I have the honor of working with, Logan Carpenter and Nick Cano.
Hi everyone, I'm Nick Cano. I'm a vulnerability analyst at Dragos, and I've been with the company for over a year, and I love it. I'm going to pass on the mic to my colleague, Logan.
Hello, everyone. I'm Logan Carpenter. I'm a vulnerability analyst here at Dragos. I've been here for about a year as well, started January last year of 2022, and excited to run through these, review the vulnerabilities of last year and get into this information. Excited. Next slide. So before we get started, I just want to briefly introduce everyone to the topics we'll be covering today. We'll go over some of the top ICS malware of 2022. Then we'll give our analysis of what we saw last year in the world of OT vulnerabilities. After that, we will jump into our focus topic, which is centered around how Dragos uniquely approaches vulnerability analysis and management. And then we will leave you all with some takeaways, recommendations, and if we have time, hopefully a little bit of Q&A with you guys. Sounds good? Cool. Let's move on to the next slide. So let's go over some of the top pieces of malware that we analyzed in 2022. So just to give a little background first, I want to give some perspective of the year we had. So what you're looking at is a timeline of every piece of ICS malware we have seen since the Big Bang, also known as Stuxnet, that specifically target ICS and OT environments. And you'll see last year was a busy year for us for these types of malware. And today we'll be going over both PipeDream and Incontroller 2. Next slide. So let's start with PipeDream. So PipeDream is near and dear to my heart. I started, like I said, January of 2022, and 2 months in, I had my welcome to Dragos moment when I was tasked with analyzing one of these modules, and it was around the same time I had my first child, so it means a lot to me. But a little bit about PipeDream. It's the 7th known ICS specific malware, so this means that it was specifically designed to target ICS and OT systems. It was unique. It was a unique situation where it was discovered before it was actually employed, which is awesome since, we can be proactive in our detections and mitigation efforts. One very unique thing about PipeDream is that it has a modular and extensible framework. So for those familiar with like Kali Linux, you could think of like Metasploit, but for ICS. Also, the sheer number of attack techniques used in PipeDream, we have never seen in the ICS world. About half of all the MITRE attack techniques that exist, PipeDream has a capability for. Another thing I want to note is that one of these modules contains a binary implant that can execute native code on a PLC, which is something we haven't seen since Trices. However, I will go into more details about these modules in the following slides. Next slide. Okay, so here's the different components. So PipeDream consists of like 5 components. Evil Scholar and Bad Omen are remotely interactive utilities for accessing and manipulating Schneider Electric and Omron devices. As far as Evil Scholar goes, it is designed to interact with code assist controllers, but it initially targeted Schneider Electric controllers. Its capabilities include scanning for new devices, brute forcing, denial of service attacks. And the biggest takeaway is that although it currently only targets Schneider Electric devices, Code Assist, as many of you may know, is used in thousands of devices across many industries. The next module is Bad Omen. This is actually the module I analyzed. Its functionality is very similar to Evil Scholar in that it interacts. It's interactive. However, Bad Omen is designed to attack Omron PLCs. And its capabilities include various network scanning techniques, uploading and downloading control logic, uploading and downloading configuration, as well as uploading and downloading files to the actual file system on a PLC. It also can sever connections, it can inject PLC implants, and it also enables a telnet backdoor on the PLC. This is all made possible by abusing hard-coded credentials found from inside of the PLC programming software. So essentially, the authors of this, Chernobyte, found these credentials within the libraries of Sysmax Studio, Omron's PLC programming software, and it abuses also an HTTP interface on the PLC that is used for Sysmax to, program and configure the PLC. And there are two things I want you to take away from Bad Omen. And one thing is that it also tries to drop and execute a TCP dump binary on that's compiled for the PLC. So it'll drop a TCP dump binary on the PLC and scan the OT network. So for those of you who may not be familiar with TCP dump, it's simply just a binary that many attackers and adversaries use to scan a network for other devices and open ports and things like that. But I think the bigger takeaway here is that it came with a CNC binary implant that is compiled to run on the PLC. And this we haven't seen since Trices. And the next module we'll go over is Mousehole. And Mousehole is an interactive utility for OPC UA servers. It can scan for servers, logs in or brute forces them. And then it can enumerate the server namespaces and nodes. It can also read and write node attributes, and this is actually what it uses to manipulate devices. And the Mousehole is based on the OPC UA Python library, which is an open source piece of software. So that makes deployment of this tool super easy. And the final two components are both targeting the Windows systems. So you can think like PCs and on the enterprise network, or in your OT network, or in enterprise networks, as well as engineering workstations as well. And Dust Tunnel and Lazy Cargo are both designed to impact those systems, those Windows systems. Lazy Cargo is an executable that attempts to drop and load a vulnerable ASRock driver on the victim machine. And Dust Tunnel is an implant for remote command and control. So essentially, Dust Tunnel, the implant, connects to a command and control server, and it can receive commands. The implant has the ability to check if it's running in a virtual environment, and has various other anti-debugging and anti-analysis techniques that makes reverse engineering it pretty difficult. Some of its capabilities also include editing the Windows registry and file system, as well as uploading and downloading files to the target, to the victim machine. So those are all the components of PipeDream. And we'll move on to the next slide. So what you have here are all the ICS and OT devices and protocols impacted by PipeDream. Also, you can see the CVEs exploited by PipeDream as well. Now, I want the protocols here to be the takeaway from this slide, more specifically Code Assist and OPC UA. And that is because of the ubiquity of these protocols. You see these in almost every, if not many or most, ICS and OT networks. And this could vastly increase the number of potentially impacted devices that are not listed here. Next slide, please. Okay, so try to bear with me here. I'm going to run through a theoretical attack scenario that we could see PipeDream be used in. What you're looking at is this graph has it's pretty much a layout of the Purdue model and the different devices and assets that will be at each level, and along with each component of PipeDream and where it could be used. So try to bear with me. This may get a little technical, but this theoretical attack would first start by Chernobyte, the threat group I mentioned earlier that developed these tools would need to gain access to the enterprise network. And this could be done through like phishing, a remote access vulnerability, known credentials or stolen credentials. But essentially they would need access to the enterprise network first. And then Chernobyte can deploy Dust Tunnel and gain persistence, that's CNC. And Dust Tunnel could be used to enumerate the network and identify like the IT, OT, DMZs. And here's where like the credentials can be captured to move laterally. Now, Chernobyte utilizes Lazy Cargo to deploy a network filter driver to hide PLC HMI communication. And once Chernobyte has access to the OT network, Mousehole can be used to identify the OPC UA servers and connected devices. And here, server structure and node information can be read and manipulated, impacting controls directly at this point. But also using the information gained from Mousehole, we can identify those, Schneider Electric or Omron, or maybe down the road, Code Assist devices that could be directly impacted by Evil Scholar or Bad Omen. And at this point, once these tools are deployed, the crown jewel objectives could be accomplished. Like, so we're talking about examples are, the safety controllers in that environment could be disabled. And operations could be manipulated to cause unsafe conditions. And that's PipeDream, our number one malware of 2022, my number one malware of 2022. And I want to send a clear message about what this malware indicates. And that is our adversaries are advancing, and this arsenal of malware is pretty much a clear indication of that. All right, let's move on to the next slide. Okay, Indestroyer 2. So Indestroyer 2 is the 6th known ICS specific malware. It was developed by the threat group Electrum, and in April of 2022, an incident marked the first time ICS malware had been reconfigured and redeployed in an electric utility environment in an attempt to shut down a Ukrainian substation. Indestroyer 2's predecessor, Crash Override, is the 4th known ICS specific malware that caused the key power disruption back in 2016. However, Indestroyer 2 does not contain all the capabilities of Crash Override, and it actually only contains one module, and that is the IEC 104 module that was within Crash Override. Next slide. Cool. So let's talk about Indestroyer 2's some of Indestroyer 2's capabilities. So Indestroyer 2, as I mentioned earlier, utilizes the IEC 104 protocol to communicate and control and communicate with industrial equipment. And this protocol allows Indestroyer 2 to change physical breaker statuses at a substation. And based on target IPs and information object addresses, there's an indication that Electrum had detailed information of the target's environment. And Electrum made attempts to improve Indestroyer 2 by pretty much making the IEC 104 traffic look more realistic, like normal IEC 104 traffic, compared to Crash Override, which the traffic was very abnormal. And the takeaway here is that our adversaries, again, they're persistent, they're active, and they're improving their tool sets. And Electrum is a clear example of this. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is a fun one. So last year, one of our analysts, Sam Hansen, stumbled across some very strange malware while analyzing an automation direct PLC. And what he discovered was that social media accounts are selling PLC password cracking software that is Trojanized with malware. This malware successfully obtains like PLC passwords by sending malicious serial requests. However, behind the scenes, it actually installs a variant of Sality. And Sality is some pretty nasty stuff. It's a well-known peer-to-peer botnet for distributed computing tasks. So those are things like crypto mining and password cracking. Some of its features include hold your breath, self-propagation, process injection, executable file injection, disabling of security alerts, clipboard hijacking, and a rootkit as well. So Like I said, the stuff is gross. Dragos originally analyzed this malware for an automation direct logic 6 PLC. The cracking software pretty much works by exploiting zero-day vulnerabilities that involve sending a payload with specific bytes to the COM port. And further research by Dragos confirmed that the cracking techniques, further research by Dragos confirmed that the techniques used can be ported to work over Ethernet as well. And another thing worth mentioning is that one sample contained 44 exploits targeting various systems. So this was a fun piece of malware to learn about from last year. Let's move on to the next slide. Let's talk a little more about it. So these are the products that the author claimed to support. So the highlighted products are the ones that we tested, and all of them do successfully crack the password. Now, you probably see that Jordan crying face there. That is the pain I felt when I seen how many OT products had password security issues. And also the fact that there's a market for black market software, for black market OT software, pains me as well. But I should mention that these products are quite old and most of them are discontinued. So, there lies a little bit of saving grace. Next slide, please. So let's get down to the nitty gritty. Let's get down to the root cause. So Dragos analyzed 3 of these samples, and 2 of them were able to directly read and write, they were directly able to read the memory address that where the passwords were stored with 0 authentication. The third vulnerability, it correctly disallowed unauthenticated read requests. However, it allowed unauthenticated write requests. So you couldn't read the data without authentication, but you could write the data without authentication. So pretty much the adversaries could just simply write over the password where it was stored. And to be honest, that third one deserves another Jordan crying face because it was so close to having both, security controls in place to prevent this from being an issue, but they came up short. And then, the other issue is that there are undocumented protocols that were abused by 2 of the 3 exploits, contain special privileged commands that were not per the protocol spec. So 2 of the 3 exploits we ran, they contain they contain commands within their protocols that were not per spec. So they didn't follow the protocol spec that they provided. And pretty much this is just a vendor backdoor, which is another problem we see all too often in ICS security. But, that's another talk for another day. Next slide. So now I'll let Nick take over and go over the state of ICS vulnerabilities.
Hi, everyone. In the following slides, I'm going to be going over the data and research that the vulnerability team went over for 2022. Next slide, please. In 2022, we did record 465 advisories. And out of all those advisories, we did end up recording 2,170 CVEs. As you can tell, the number of CVEs and disclosed vulnerabilities is exponentially growing per year. And you might be wondering, why might this be the case? A lot of people may think it's because vulnerable products are becoming more vulnerable, but in reality, it's because a lot more researchers are paying attention to the OT space. Since we now have more researchers doing research on our product within the OT space, this means that a lot more stuff is being disclosed for us to actually acknowledge. I also want to know that Dragos does have multiple sources when it comes to identifying known vulnerabilities or just vulnerabilities in general, whether we pull from CISA, NIST, vendors directly, or researchers directly, and more. Next slide, please. Out of 465 advisories, 34% of those advisories did come with a CVSS incorrect score. After analyzing and correcting, we did discover that 70% of these scores happen to be more severe, and 29 of them used to be less severe. This is important because CVSS score is one of the many factors we use to prioritize a vulnerability, which I will be covering later in the slides. Next slide, please. This is a CVSS correction example. Primarily, it's an information disclosure that happens to be credential exposure through network traffic capture. Original scores given did focus on the integrity and availability of the vulnerability, but in reality, after analyzing and digging deeper within it, we realized that this happened to be more of a confidentiality issue, which is why the score started from a 9.8, downgrade to a 7.6, and then we then corrected to a 6.5. I do want to note that not every information disclosure vulnerability would have this score. It just all depends primarily on the vulnerability and its details, which could vary per vulnerability itself. Next slide, please. So where do vulnerabilities reside? As you can tell, level 2 and 3 do happen to have 63% of most of the vulnerabilities disclosed. And you might be wondering why that is the case. There's a couple factors, but one of the biggest things is the engineering workstation, softwares, platforms, web servers are primarily or mostly found within these levels. And these products and things that I just mentioned are easier to obtain, more affordable in some cases, and also sometimes even provide free versions as opposed to, let's say, a PLC controller or a sensor within level 0 and 1. Not only is it more efficient or more affordable and easier to obtain within the level 2 and 3, it is more common for more researchers to know how to do research on software than it is to do research on firmware and PLC or any controller within level 0 and 1. And then we did provide a graph on the right side, so just you could have a bit more of an idea within the Purdue levels itself. Next slide, please. I do want to direct your attention towards the pie graph on the left side. And then as you can see, out of all the advisories of the year, 83% of them were deep within the ICS network. And what that means is that 83% of them were found between Purdue level 3 all the way down to 0, which is definitely closer to the OT environment and or the OT impact itself. We did include 15% of them, including the bordering the enterprise. And you might be wondering, why did we include the percent or just in general enterprise vulnerabilities if this is about OT? The reason why that would be is because enterprise vulnerabilities by themselves can be an initial pivoting access to the OT environment, which is pretty important to know that that is one of the main reasons or ways that you can get into the OT environment. Then if we pay attention to the graphs on the right, we do notice on the top right, the red bar would be the 2022 year. It shows that 49% of the vulnerabilities recorded had neither loss of view or loss of control to the OT environment, which is pretty good. It's saying that a lot of these vulnerabilities aren't impacting the OT environment. Unfortunately, if you look a bit more lower, we do notice that 50% of those vulnerabilities do cause the loss of view and loss of control to the OT environment, which is a pretty high percent difference compared to last year's 35%. And then finally, for the remaining 1%, it is found primarily within vulnerabilities that only cause a loss of view within the vulnerabilities within the OT environment for the year of 2022. Next slide, please. Great. So out of 465 advisories that we've covered, 70% of these advisories do have a patch and 30% of them don't. Now, this in a way could be good, but at the same time, not everybody has the option to patch or is even necessary, which is why the more important score on the right side is the 77%. 77% of all the advisories together do not contain any practical mitigation other than just patch. And like I said, it's not really a solution for everybody. So Dragos did find a solution to this, which we will go more into detail later in the slides. Next slide, please. Out of all the advisories, only 2% of the vulnerabilities are needed to be addressed as now. And there's a couple factors for this. Primarily, it's because these vulnerabilities are either actively exploited, have a proof of concept, and have a direct impact to OT. These are one of the main key factors for it, which is why they are primarily going to be addressed now rather than any other time. And the one next to it would be the 68% of vulnerabilities. And these vulnerabilities have network exploitation, with some having limited to no impact, which is why we do have them addressed as the next after the now, of course. And then finally, we're going to have the 30% vulnerabilities, which are more than likely never going to be addressed. And the reason for this is because they have an unrealistic, really hard way of exploitation. And it's also vulnerabilities that require physical access. Now, you might be wondering, why would we include 30% of these vulnerabilities if they're more than likely never to be addressed. And the reason for this is because it's also pretty good just to be aware of the vulnerabilities that do exist, regardless if you have to patch them right away or never. Next slide, please. Right, and then now I will be passing it over to my colleague, Logan.
Okay, thanks, Nick, for everything. So now we'll be hopping into our focus topic. You can go ahead and hop over to the next slide. Okay, so one of the most important responsibilities of our vulnerability team is to assist with vulnerability management. And we do this by analyzing vendor advisories and extracting the information that is like most important for OT security decision makers. We also hunt for vulnerabilities in common OT, devices and software. And pretty much we want to dive into what makes Dragos's like vulnerability team and insights unique. And some of those are focusing our analysis on OT impacts, helping asset owners decide what is important, working with vendors on disclosures and clarification of reports. And there are a few other ways that we go about, handling vulnerability management. And we'll discuss each one of those points that I just mentioned in more detail throughout the next slide. So let's move on. So we try our best to work with vendors as much as we can, and transparent communication and dialogues helps us help vendors addressing their issues, and it also helps our customers get the highest quality intel and the most secure products. And when we find vulnerabilities, we work patiently and closely with vendors for responsible disclosure. We generally give vendors 90 days to work with us before we move on and publish the advisory ourselves. Sometimes we do wait a little longer depending on the situation. We also offer final review of our reports to the vendors, and when necessary, we will also provide proof of concepts that maybe our vulnerability analysts developed. So like, let's say we find a vulnerability and we create a proof of concept to exploit that vulnerability. We'll actually offer that proof of concept to the vendor as well. When analyzing advisories, if we, come across an advisory we may not understand or we think may be missing data, we'll also make attempts to reach out to the vendors for clarification. Now, all of those things I just mentioned have mixed results. Sometimes vendors are super excited to work with us on a disclosure, and sometimes they literally just completely ignore us. And sometimes they'll start communicating with us and then randomly throughout the process just disappear. Another thing I have noticed is that, vendors sometimes get a little weird when acknowledging vulnerabilities, which explains the meme that I have over there to the right. All too often, if you're a vulnerability analyst that's had to work with vendors, you'll understand it's a feature, not a vulnerability, or other ways of downplaying security issues. And, this is something that, is pretty common to experience, like you saying, because we implemented that insecure feature on purpose, it's not a vulnerability. And like, our asset owners, the asset owners, right, that purchase that product may not, like that feature or even be aware of that feature in some places. So that's why, sometimes you got to give a little sugar with the medicine. Instead of calling it a vulnerability, you call it a happy accident. That's what that meme is about. But, we understand that threats to ICS and OT devices they're a fairly new concept compared to IT. And what we're experiencing is just those same growing pains that IT had when that IT had to work through in their early days. And now, one thing that Dragos tries to do to combat this friction is by creating official partnerships to help mature, vendor product security and build that trust between us and between Dragos and vendors. Because at the end of the day, right, like all we care about is, the customers that have these assets in their environments being pleased and happy and feeling safe and secure with those devices, right? And in order for that to happen, the security vendors and the product vendors have to work together and have to have that trust in order to provide, the best services and the best intel and the best, the most secure products to, the community of industrial asset owners. I'll let Nick take over for the next couple slides.
Yeah, so as mentioned earlier, 77% of advisories do not have any practical mitigations other than just patching. And for a lot of people, this may not actually be an option. So how Dragos tackled this is by including and giving you guys the actionable mitigation by providing protocols, port numbers, services, and entry points used for exploitation. All these things could be an alternative to just patching, but not only that, they can also be used to create detections, which Dragos does make as time goes based on the vulnerabilities we do analyze. I also do want to bring up the OT specific impacts. Each advisory kind of analyze itself. We do want to make sure if these particular vulnerabilities have any form of OT impact, as we mentioned in the previous slides when it comes to loss of view and loss of control. And if it doesn't have any, then great. We will also include that kind of detail there, but we want to make sure that that itself is accurate. And referring to accuracy, there's a couple key factors. We want to make sure that the person or the reader is informed of any critical information that might be missing from the original advisory, making sure that the reader is aware of this vulnerabilities affecting the OT environment, whether it's through impact, loss of view, loss of control, or both. But as well, the CVSS score is correct. As we've also mentioned, this is something we correct, as these are all kind of many of the factors that we use to prioritize the vulnerability, which we will be going more into detail on the next slide. So next slide, please. So not all vulns are created equal. As you know, some vulnerabilities are more harmful than others, and you might be wondering, how do I prioritize them? Well, first off, let's say CVSS score wasn't actually designed for the OT environment. This is just one of the many metrics we use to identify what should be a priority. We at Dragos use multiple factors, which include is the vulnerability actively exploited? Does it have a public proof of concept? What is impact that this vulnerability does? And of course, the CVSS score that gets tied together all by itself. And then as you can tell on the picture on the right, it is just an example saying, okay, we have two CVSS 10, which could be harmful, but in reality, the real problem happens to be the CVSS 6 that happens to have a public proof of concept, and it is actively being used. So I have bad news for you. If you're only using the CVSS score to determine your priority, then you might not be actually prioritizing what's important for your OT environment. Next slide, please. Then I will be passing over to my colleague, Logan.
So takeaways and recommendations. You can go ahead and move on to the next slide. So there's a few things that we want you guys a few takeaways we want you all to take away from this webinar. And, one of the big ones is that, PipeDream showcases a new extensible and modular OT focused malware framework. And an operator with basic computers and command line skills can carry out attacks on critical infrastructure just based on how, a lot of the tools within PipeDream are designed. And this makes Trojanized a threat to all ICS organizations. The next point is our adversaries are stepping it up and maturing. Therefore, ICS organizations, security vendors, and product vendors need to be as well. We need to step it up as well to stay a step ahead of our adversaries. Next slide. So some more takeaways. Downloading sketchy password cracking software is a bad idea. And I know this seems pretty obvious, but a market for this exists for a reason. So, just don't download sketchy password cracking software. Just don't download sketchy software in general in OT networks. How about that? How about we do that? And not all vulnerabilities are urgent, and patches aren't always the best mitigation. Nick pointed to that earlier, and that's why, when we go about assessing, different advisories that we come across, we keep this in mind, that, our customers may not be able to put a patch in for 6 months. or, it may require them to shut down operations to put a patch in. And that's, a lot to ask for. And sometimes it's unreasonable. So what are other, workarounds or mitigations we can put in place so that our customers' environments are a little more secure? And finally, Dragos does everything in its power to offer the highest quality intel possible. We have a world-class team, and each and every one of us on this team is responsible for a lot of the reports that some of you guys, maybe subscribe to and see. And, we work very hard and diligently and put in countless hours to make sure that our intel reports are the best that is out there. Next slide. I'll let Nick take over.
So I wanted to cover a bit on the SANS 5 ICS cybersecurity critical controls. There's 5 of them, but we will primarily be talking about number 5, which is the risk-based vulnerability management, because of course, we are covering the vulnerability section as we are vulnerability researchers. The main focus of the vulnerability management is not only to patch the vulnerabilities, but also to mitigate their impacts or monitor further exploitation. The vulnerability management is also to prioritize what's important. As I mentioned in the past slides, there's a lot of factors that go into play to deciding what is best for prioritizing based on your environment and the vulnerability and what is more impactful within it. Next slide, please.
So now we'll jump into the Q&A portion. So if anyone, has any questions, you can just jump down to the Q&A chat and post it in there. There's some of you that have already posted questions, and we'll try to answer a few while we have some time too. One of the questions that I did see was, does Dragos have its own dedicated ICS OT test bed, or do your researchers have their own labs? I'll speak for the vulnerability team. The answer to that is yes and yes. We have our own setup sometimes in our own homes. One of our analysts has an entire pretty much OT network in his basement. And then like for myself, I have, devices and things like that I have in my home that I test on. And then we also have a remote environment that Dragos has that has many different OT networks within it. So the answer to that question is we have both, labs in our own homes, and we have a central lab that Dragos hosts. Great question. So here's one that I can answer as well. So they ask, when you talk to vendors about vulnerabilities in their products, can you give examples of successful interactions that you had that led to vendors working with you? I won't, be specific, but there's been cases where I've personally worked with a vendor, and the process was very smooth. We got the report out in time. They, didn't take a super long to respond, and they were on completely different time zones. Their PCERT team was on a completely different time zone, and they worked with us and coordinated us, and we all got our reports out at the same time. And the process happened very quickly. Now, to the other end of that, we've had issues where, like I mentioned earlier, we've had vendors ghost us, and we've had vendors, say they want to work with us, and then actually, no, we don't want to do this. This is not our problem. So we've kind of had every situation, but I want to mention, and I want to be clear, there are great positive vendor interactions that we have. And a lot of the times when we do have those bad interactions, we just understand that like a lot of the times, vendors are just trying to make sure that they're positioning, doing what's best for them as well. So we understand that like, this is a new area to be addressed for them, in that, like they're not super used to dealing with, the same people. Hey, we found a vulnerability. Hey, we found a vulnerability. Hey, we found a vulnerability. And, sometimes they don't have the funds to handle, or to have the team to handle all those issues. So that was a great question.
I can actually go over one of the questions. Was referred to, how do you keep up with new vulnerabilities? So one of the main ways we keep up with vulnerabilities in general is we're constantly checking from different sources. As I've mentioned earlier, CISA by itself does produce some of the advisories or release some of the newer disclosures because they work either with the researcher or vendor. We also not only use from those sources, we go directly to the vendor itself. Researchers sometimes do public announcements or public blogs that no vendor or anybody is really paying attention towards, that they have attempted to disclose towards them. Stuff like this doesn't even have a CVE, yet we still want to make sure that is acknowledged by the public as a vulnerability. So those are kind of the main ones as well. We do use NIST as another source. It's kind of pulling from, I believe, like over 10 different sources individually. We have, vendors by themselves, CISA, NIST, researchers individually, and sometimes even POCs that are found in the wild do showcase some of the vulnerabilities that were typically or tried to be disclosed with vendors, but the vendors either didn't reach out back or just didn't really put in too much time towards fully doing a proper disclosure. I do want to go over another question as well. Somebody asked, how do you know which 2% of the vulnerabilities that you have to attend to immediately? So we analyze all these vulnerabilities. We have a data set as to how we're going to then pick what to prioritize. Our platform by itself, it is the Dragos platform, is able to basically tell you itself that these are the specific vulnerabilities that you have to prioritize. And that's basically pulling from our data as if it has an OT impact, is it actively exploited, and so on that I mentioned earlier. But the platform itself is what's going to help you organize and prioritize your vulnerabilities themselves.
I did see a question. I can't seem to find it, but it asked, well, I can't find it, but pretty much it asked, how can you tell if you have a vulnerable asset that is actually like operational? So if there's an asset that you have that's operational, how can you tell it's vulnerable? The short answer to that is platform and intel. What that'll enable us to do is like pretty much Dragos will know if you have this particular asset in your environment. Let's say like PLC ABC, right? For just a generic random name. Let's say PLC ABC has a vulnerability in it, right? And you have that in your environment. There's one of two ways, right? Through platform, it'll point out that that device is vulnerable to something that was recently released. Or the other way is our intel reports, right? If you see an intel report come out or a VA come out that is directed towards a particular device that is in your environment that is operational, then by going over through that intel report, you can determine whether or not that particular device you have in your environment is vulnerable or not. A question that that just came in was, do we look for 0-day vulnerabilities? I guess per definition, right? Technically, any undiscovered vulnerability that is not known to the public is a 0-day. So the answer to that is yes. When we do vulnerability assessments on devices and we find bugs or we find vulnerabilities in them, at that moment that we discover them, it's considered a 0-day. Now, it stops being a 0-day once we reach out to the vendor and say, hey, there's an issue in your product that we found. Here it is. And we go through the process of releasing the advisories to the public. And I did see one more question I wanted to answer in here. And I'm looking for it. So, hold on. So it asked, there was a question that asked, do I think that industrial companies, I'm assuming they mean vendors, do they still prioritize the OT vulnerabilities? The answer to that is yes. Still do think they believe that the vulnerabilities are important. And that's why most of the times when we reach out to them, when we found vulnerabilities, they for the most part are they jump on top of it and work with us to get out the advisories. Kind of my personal outlook on it is, as of now, right? Like the climate now doesn't permit like a lot of these, even some of the asset owners being super worried. But we have to protect our systems now, because in the future, geopolitical things can change and different things can happen that will create a higher that will create more threats that asset owners have to be on the lookout for. So my outlook on it is, right, we get this good security hygiene in place right now, so that inevitably when the time comes and ICS systems and OT systems across the world are being attacked, we're in the best position to deal with those vulnerabilities quicker, opposed to it being, sometimes we've had vulnerabilities take a year to get published, right? And that's acceptable now, right? But down the road, those vulnerabilities there's going to be more people looking for these vulnerabilities. There's going to be more bad guys looking for these vulnerabilities. And there's going to be situations where the bad guys may beat us to those vulnerabilities. So that process of, getting out mitigations and publishing and letting asset owners know quickly will become more important in the future when kind of those geopolitical and different things change. So Nick, do you have any more questions?
Okay, so actually I do have one more, and it says, would it be safer to call never, not yet? And they're referring to the 30% of vulnerabilities that we basically said that aren't really a priority. It doesn't necessarily mean that you never have to do it. It's just saying there's a lot more things much more important than these things. Off the top of my head, one of the vulnerabilities that I analyzed was about being able to change the configurations of a PLC controller. But the only problem was that you would have to then bypass physical access, a controller stuck in a cabinet with locks and all these kind of things. So that's why we've also put them in there, just because a lot of these things aren't necessarily never really a thing that you should ignore, which is why we tell you about them, but rather it's things that are not very likely for them to happen. If somebody's able to get into your business or company or environment by itself without, by avoiding security and physical places like locks and whatnot, then I think you have a bigger issue than patching that vulnerability. But yeah, that would be it, I guess, in that case.
So I have another question that came in. So do you think more vendors are building devices with security built in? And if so, what areas do you think still need improvement? To answer the first part, yes, exponentially more. If you look at devices that were created like in the late 2000s, like the 2010s and in that era, versus the devices that are being put out today, they are doing a lot more to lock down, just a lot better security practices. But there's still a lot of work to be done. In the areas of improvement, I think we need to move past this or find a better way. Vendors just need to find a better way of implementing their backdoors. All too often we find backdoors in these devices that are have hard-coded or easy to figure out passwords and things like that. I mean, PipeDream had a backdoor that was for the vendor, more specifically Bad Omen, and the vendor backdoor mentioned in the PLC cracking software. And there's been other devices that I have seen in my past that I can name that have backdoors as well. And these are all OT devices, whether it be like an OT router or a PLC. And as far as the other part of that question, so I kind of answered the areas that you think need to improve. But outside of, backdoors, I think, just basic security, secure programming practices haven't quite completely translated over. Like things like, locking down, or encrypting your like firmware encryption. There are some vendors that, they publish all their firmware, on their website, and I can just go download it for every single device that they have. And I can easily reverse engineer it and things like that, right? Because at least putting steps in place to make it harder for the adversaries to, reverse engineer your code. Another thing too is like, most times, especially for a lot of this programming software, a lot of times the debug symbols are right there, right? So I can literally pop a lot of these DLLs, which are like the libraries the software uses to, do its thing. I can pop a lot of these Windows DLLs into, software that will literally give me source code. So instead of having to read machine code, I can read, source code with, function names and variable names and everything. So I think moving towards that direction and kind of, protecting, putting those first steps in place of like, preventing the adversaries from reverse engineering and getting a hold of their stuff is one step. And then that next step is just, those basic, programming practices that will prevent stuff from using things like string copy, for instance, right? Like things like that. But I think we're done today as far as this presentation goes. Before we get out of here and before I pass it back to Danielle, I want to personally thank everyone from marketing and that was involved in making this webinar happen. But more specifically, I want to thank our vulnerability team for just doing such awesome research last year. We have some true studs on our team, and I can go straight down the line and explain about how each engineer knocked one out of the park this year. And I'm just so happy to work with these guys. I love the culture here at Dragos, and I love my team, and I love you, Kate. That's my manager. Want to give a quick shout out to Kate Vajada. But yeah, Danielle, you can take it over.
Great. Thanks. Thanks, Logan and Nick. That was awesome. So thank you all for your time today. I really recommend reading the full year in review report for more information if you've not done so already. And you can catch us again in May. We have another webinar for a part of the series on May 16th. And that is lessons learned from the front line. So thank you very much for your time today, and have a great day.